Thank you again to Tim Hortons for sponsoring it again this year. So they donated the coffee and donuts. I hope you all enjoy them. We're very happy to have our new curator, Rachel Bellis. So if you haven't met Rachel, you'll meet her now.
Okay.
And she is going to do her first presentation for the museum on Presidential Mourning, since February is President's Day. So, and just to give her a quick plug, she did this as a digital exhibit for the White House. So she's now going to share that with us. So we have something in common with the White House.
Wow. We got to get you.
Yeah, so I just want to say this is, like as Ryan said, this is sort of my introduction as curator of the Holland Land Office Museum. So I'm going to go over a bit of introduction of myself, of the topic, and how we got here today. Oops, hold on a sec. Hold on. Yeah, so I'm going to go over first a brief introduction of myself, of the topic, and just how we got here. So my specialty is dress and textile history, and during my master's program, I had this opportunity to design and publish a virtual exhibit for the White House Historical Association in Washington, D.C. Hold on a sec. Still a lot of issues on this. Okay, I don't know why this isn't working. Okay, sorry about this. All right. So I just want to talk about what the White House Historical Association is. It's a nonprofit organization. It was first started by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. She began the association because she really sort of had this foresight of, the history that's happening here in this building is important to document and keep. So she really wanted to preserve the history of the White House. She saw the value in there being an entity that would do that in perpetuity. So she established the White House Historical Association. And then 2 years before I started working with them, the WHHA started an internship partnership with NYU, which is where I got my degree. And I applied for it while I was in school. So I designed a proposal for an exhibit on mourning textiles and dress at the White House throughout history. And I was selected to create this digital exhibit for them, which is called Black Cloth, Mourning Dress and Drapery at the White House. So I first became interested in mourning fashion when I saw this image here at the left. If you can see that there, that is those were the decorations that were put on the edifice after the assassination of President Garfield. And as you can see, it's completely just festooned with black ribbons and fabric. And I've never seen anything like it, so I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So when this opportunity arose to do this exhibit, I wanted to show the way that black fabric has been used very abundantly throughout history and so differently than it is used today to represent grief and mourning. And the rituals of mourning surrounding black cloth used to be much more regularized, and they used to be much more strict in centuries past. So this exhibit looks at sort of two sides of White House history when it comes to mourning. It looks at both how the building itself was decorated, how the facade was decorated, and what the first ladies wore when they were in mourning for their husbands. And to keep it a manageable size, I only looked at the 8 presidents who died in office, because there was also ceremonies for presidents who were out of office and died, but not quite so grand as the ones that died in office. So I'm going to share a little bit of the research I did for the project and show you some of the objects that I selected that are presented in the online display. So this isn't everything I did. The digital exhibit is still up online on the White House Historical Association website. If you ever want to look at the full thing, you can still do that. But yeah, we're just going to do a sort of brief overview of it today. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know about mourning is that these were, rules that developed over time. They began in the 18th century, and they became very strict by the middle of the 19th century. And we have to discuss what the norms were exactly so that we can talk about why the widowed first ladies were wearing what they did, and so you can just understand how complex and important that these rules were to people. It's a bit of a difficult topic to study because although the rules were very strict and heavily imposed socially on people, different sources sometimes offered conflicting rules. You would have etiquette books that said you have to do it this way, another author would say you have to do it that way. There's also, it's confusing because over geography and time, so, you know, a woman in Philadelphia in 1850 would mourn differently than a woman in New York in 1875, for example. But there were some rules that were more or less consistent, and we can remember that this period generally required black accessories, plain heavy veils, and dresses made with plain black fabrics when we're talking about what people were wearing for mourning. This chart that I have up here shows the general rules of how a family would observe mourning dress at the very height of deep mourning culture, which was the last quarter of the 19th century. This is sort of the pinnacle of the sort of standardization of rules of mourning. So two things that are important here. How one was related to the deceased dictated how long a person would have to wear black clothing for. And the type of fabric was also taken into account. So earlier on in the mourning periods, lusterless fabrics, meaning fabrics that don't reflect light, these were fabrics like crepe, which is a lightweight transparent silk gauze with a dull surface, or bombazine, which was a dense fabric made of silk and wool. These weren't shiny the way silk is. If you think about a silk dress or something, you know, it catches the light and reflects it back, and that was considered too cheerful for mourning. So at first, they very deliberately picked fabrics that had no reflection. They wouldn't be wearing jewelry. They wanted everything to be very dull and dark. But then later on in the periods, it was appropriate to slowly add back in jewelry, rich fabrics, other colors, and to allow people to know when they could transition into a different sort of period of mourning. The etiquette guides tried to set these out very precisely. So first mourning, which is also called deep mourning, that's right after a person had died. That was the most, serious of all of the mourning periods. As you can see, a widow for a husband, her first mourning period would be 1 year and 1 day. She would have to wear black and she would have to wear veils for at least 1 year and 1 day before she could move on to a sort of less strict phase of her mourning. And interestingly, you see below widower for wife, 3 months. So it wasn't exactly even. Who you were and how you were related to a person definitely mattered. And if you were a woman, you were doing a lot more mourning, ritualized mourning with your dress and with your behaviors than men were expected to do. So there's deep mourning, first mourning, that's the same thing. Then there's second mourning, third mourning, and then half mourning, which is when you start to introduce colors back. And there are some shades that we don't think of as mourning colors today that were worn during this period. There's like purples and like grays. Those were considered half mourning colors. Yeah. So we're just going to jump right in then. The first president that we're going to talk about is Abraham Lincoln. So he died on April 15th, 1865. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at a theater performance in Washington, D.C., and this was just days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee. So it's the last days of the Civil War. People were really excited, and then all of a sudden, they were suddenly thrust into this national mourning period. People were so upset about it that they needed to express it physically, and so they wore black clothing and they decorated the entire city of DC in black. So his funeral was really solemn, and yet the pomp and circumstances was really unprecedented because remember, this is the first president to have been assassinated, so it was a really shocking moment for the country. As we can see in this image, this is an engraving that was made a month after Lincoln was assassinated, and the subject is just a grand review of the army, so it's just a military parade. But in the background, what's really interesting is you can see the White House, and that's the north portico. The columns are wrapped in black cloth for Abraham Lincoln. This is a month after he died. So the mourning period for Lincoln was a month long. it was a very long period, and the White House was covered in black for that whole time. So this is an image that where we can see that sort of decoration using black fabric around the north portico columns. To talk a little bit more about the funeral, not only was the White House decorated, but his coffin was placed on a draped funeral car. It was pulled by white horses, and his body was the first to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. The catafalque, which is sort of the platform that supported the coffin, that is still used for state funerals today. So super important, sort of the rituals that were surrounding Abraham Lincoln's funeral, those are still really important to our culture of mourning today for presidents, for state funerals. So Lincoln's body was taken to Illinois by train, and the train was itself covered in black cloth. The train stopped in cities along the way so that more Americans than ever could participate in mourning the president. And actually the train stopped here in Batavia. So if you go to our new exhibit that's up in the historic wing of the museum, you can see a picture of the Batavia Depot, which was draped in mourning fabric to welcome the train. And there's a picture of the Dean Richmond, which was a locomotive that pulled Lincoln's funeral train. Dean Richmond, of course, was one of Batavia's most preeminent gentlemen. He was a very rich man. And his locomotive, the Dean Richmond, pulled the funeral train. Okay, so this is the only photograph that exists of the White House draped in mourning for Abraham Lincoln. You can see around the north portico, if you see the columns look black, that's because there's cloth wrapped around them. And there's also streamers of black cloth decorating the north door entrance and the flanking windows. Really interesting, a historian at the White House Historical Association told me that they believe this carriage out in front was actually was waiting for Mary Todd Lincoln as she was about to leave the White House for good. I don't know how they got that information, but very intriguing possibility. So this is an engraving of Lincoln's funeral in the East Room. So there was two funerals. It was, his body lay in state in the Capitol, but also it lay in state in the East Room of the White House itself. So the sheer amount of black fabric decorating the White House was both in and out, was symbolizing the great grief of Lincoln supporters. There was a quote I found that said, "The East Room, quote, was draped with crepe and black cloth, relieved only here and there by white flowers and green leaves. The catafalque, which is the platform that supported the coffin, was about 15 feet high and covered with a domed canopy of black cloth, which was supported by 4 pillars and was lined beneath with fluted white silk." So this description pretty accurately matches what we see here in this engraving. This was made 3 years after the death of Lincoln, but we do believe it's pretty accurate. You can see in the background, there's curtains, black curtains they're covering the windows, so that, again, light was considered too cheerful. So everything had to be dark. The windows were covered, as well as, handy dandy pointer, the mirrors were draped with black cloth as well, to sort of dull the shine of the mirrors. The one thing that doesn't seem to be accurate is right here, Mary Todd Lincoln is depicted. She was not actually at the East Room funeral of Lincoln. This is because she was too distraught and she couldn't come downstairs. So her edition here is sort of Artist's Liberty, but in it he depicted her in first mourning. So she's wearing completely all black head to toe, and she also has a very heavy veil covering her face. So during the American Civil War, of course, mourning practices were, a lot of women had to go into black. A lot of people had to go into black because a lot of soldiers died. So I found this engraving for a newspaper called "Cemetery in New Orleans, Louisiana. Widow and daughters in full mourning, carrying flowers and wreaths to adorn the graves of their relatives killed in the war." So this image shows how women and girls in first mourning would look in public. So their veils would usually be over their faces if they were in first mourning. They weren't allowed, it was considered improper for a woman in first mourning to show her face for the first year. while she was out in public. And women did not really enjoy this. I found a really interesting piece of wry advice for widows from a magazine called Godey's Ladies Book and Magazine, and it talks about the burden this placed on women. So they say kind of sarcastically, quote, "Her veil then is of double crepe, and no matter what the state or of the atmosphere may be, woe to her if a stickler for etiquette should see her raise it before the prescribed 12 months have passed. She may breathe comfortably after that, if she chooses, or go on blinding and stifling herself 3 or 5 years, if she chooses." So these veils weren't very comfortable, but it was absolutely necessary socially to be seen as a proper woman, if you were out in public for the first year after a death in the family, for example, that you would have your whole face covered with a very heavy crepe veil. So if you look at the image, 2 of the women here have their veils pushed back over their bonnets. This is probably inaccurate. The illustrator probably did this just so that he can show their facial expressions more clearly, but this was more the norm, how women would wear veils over their faces. Okay, so this is Mary Todd Lincoln in mourning attire. So she remained secluded in the White House for 6 weeks after the assassination of her husband. She was, by all accounts, very distraught. When she did emerge, she was dressed in all black. She had a heavy veil covering her features, and she got into her carriage, that might be the one that we saw earlier, and drove away from the White House forever. This was not the first time that Mary Todd Lincoln wore mourning at the White House. Her young son Willie died there in 1862. She chose to stay in mourning clothing for the rest of her life after the passing of Abraham Lincoln, and doing so put the former First Lady in really deep financial straits. She was already $70,000 in debt to various stores in Washington, D.C. when she left the White House. There's really interesting letters of Abraham Lincoln's where he's complaining about, my wife will not stop buying clothes, and he's pretty upset about it. But it was expensive to buy a whole new wardrobe all in black, right? And everything had to change. It had to be not only the clothes, she not only had to buy veils, but she had to have accessories, her fans, her gloves, her undergarments. Everything had to be mourning related. So everything, it was really expensive, but her position in society dictated. It depended on her ability to adhere to correct mourning dress etiquette. Proper mourning wear was such an important part of an upper-class woman's wardrobe that she risked social ostracism if she failed to conform to the rigid dress rituals surrounding bereavement. It was sort of like, to prove you were a lady, the right kind of proper lady, the better you could follow these rules, the more solid your position was. So this was probably taken 1865 to 1882. It shows her in mourning, and her veil is lifted back to show her face. So you could indoors show your face. So it was only outside that you had to have the veil over, but a widow who's inside a photo studio taking a photo, she can have her veil back. She doesn't appear to be what was the deepest or first mourning, so this is probably after 1 year, 1 day had passed since Lincoln had died. So how do we know that? If you look here, she has little white cuffs on.
And her hood.
And she's got flowers on her hood, which that wouldn't have been, if she was in really deep mourning, this would have been too much embellishment. And the type of fabric the dress has. Like I said, one of the most common mourning fabrics was called crepe. It was this wrinkled sort of silk gauze that was very dull. And she does not appear to be wearing any of that on her dress. So this is probably a year after or more after Lincoln passed away. We talked a little bit about accessories. Here's one of Mary Todd Lincoln's mourning accessories. This is a mourning fan in a type of shimmering silk called moire. It's trimmed with sequins, and it's set on black hardwood sticks. So the sparkle of these sequins here, and like the colors of the fabric, and the fact that it's made out of this lustrous silk, this shiny silk, suggests that these were used after the year-long period of first mourning. This was a really interesting find for me. So it's hard to see in the photograph, but this is what was called a spirit photograph. These were very popular at the time. You know, photography was a new technology, and people were sort of superstitious about it. They didn't really know what it could do, and a lot of people believed that it could take, if you took a photograph of someone, you could sometimes capture the spirit of a dead loved one. So it's hard to see, but you can kind of see Abraham Lincoln. Here's his hands on her shoulder. There's like a ghostly apparition of Lincoln behind Mary Todd Lincoln.
Okay.
So the person who took this was photographer W.H. Mumler. He claimed to be able to take photographs of deceased people's ghosts, and he wrote of meeting Mrs. Lincoln. She visited his Boston studio in 1872, and he described how the former First Lady gave a pseudonym. She gave a pseudonym, and she also wore such a heavy crepe veil that it was impossible to distinguish a single feature of her face. And then she refused to remove it until right before he was about to take the picture. She threw off her veil and he snapped the picture. And then later, in the sort of post-production process, he added this sort of image of Lincoln standing over her. Mumler's wife at the time told the grieving former First Lady that she had convened with the spirit of Mrs. Lincoln's most recently deceased son, Tad. Mumler recounted that Mrs. Lincoln cried, quote, tears of joy that she had again found her loved ones and apparently anxious to learn, if possible, how long before she could join them in their spirit home. So, unfortunately, it seems like this was a charlatan that preyed upon a grieving widow. She just wanted to sort of see her husband again, know that he was doing all right, and wanted to know when she would see him again. If we look at her dress, if you see these, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but there's like wrinkled fabric right here around her collar and up here on her hat. That's probably mourning crepe, this sort of crinkled fabric. That was very popular for mourning wear. And then we're moving on to James Garfield. So James Garfield died September 19th, 1881. He was shot by an assassin at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., but he didn't die of his wounds until about 2 months later. And this was only 16 years after the murder of Abraham Lincoln, so the funeral services and the mourning decorations took a lot of inspiration from Lincoln's. And because he didn't die of his wounds immediately, the public was much more prepared, right, for his death than they had been for previous presidents. So they organized and participated in massive mourning rites. Over 70,000 Americans waited in line at the Capitol to pay their respects, and the city of Washington was said to be so bedecked in black cloth that the buildings were nearly hidden from view. I found Garfield's daughter Molly's diary, and she wrote in it, the whole city was draped in mourning. Even the shanties where the people were so poor that they had to tear up their clothes in order to show people the deep sympathy and respect they had for Papa. All persons are friends in this deep and great sorrow. So we have to talk a little bit about Lucretia Garfield, the First Lady, who's depicted right here. Her marriage to James Garfield was a very happy one. He wrote in his diaries that he hadn't seen her for 2 weeks, and so he rode to see her train as it passed by the town just to catch a glimpse of her face. They were very happily married. After his assassination, Mrs. Garfield chose to wear mourning attire in public for the rest of her life. So she died 37 years after the president. And as a result, she was frequently called in the media the Lady in Black, because she became sort of known for her mourning clothes because she wore it for so long. This was not common, but every now and then you do see widows who decided, my husband has died and I'm going to remain in black for the rest of my life. So this engraving is President Garfield's bedroom at the White House, where he was brought after he was shot, and Lucretia Garfield's dress. Mourning clothes generally followed the shape, the silhouette of fashion of the day. It was really in the fabrics and the decoration where they differed. So she might have, after he passed away, worn a similar type of dress to what you see in this image. This engraving is a wood engraving, 1881, and it depicts the vigil outside the White House as President James Garfield fought for his life due to an assassination attempt. So again, just reiterating that, mourning was sort of it was a very public thing. Now we think of it as sort of private within the family, but this was definitely part of like the national conversation. And here's a bigger picture of the Garfield White House covered in black cloth. This is the clearest depiction we have of the White House draped in mourning. And it's possible because this was extreme even for the time. We saw Lincoln's White House, which had the north portico columns wrapped and a couple streamers around the windows and doors, but this is next level. It's on every side of the building, it's on every window, there's just so much ribbon, and so maybe they thought this is worth documenting. Again, we have Lucretia Garfield. This photograph over here shows Lucretia Garfield still in mourning towards the end of her life. And I want to talk a little bit about what's on her head here. So she's wearing a type of cap meant for widows that was called a Mary Stuart cap or bonnet. So this type of headwear was characterized by a small V-point shape down over the forehead. And it was a style introduced by Queen Victoria after her husband died in 1861. She also wore black for the rest of her life. So she sort of made this fashion, these type of widow's caps. And it comes from inspiration from Mary Queen of Scots, because she also would wear in portraits these sort of heart-shaped headdresses. By the early 1900s, when this photograph of Lucretia Garfield was taken, this style was very much out of date. I found a 1905 issue of Harper's Bazaar, the women's magazine, and it mentioned that, quote, only on elderly women is the close-fitting small bonnet with long veil seen. So this was rapidly going out of style. Again, another accessory. This is a letter written by Lucretia Garfield on black bordered paper. So that was stationery. Mourning stationery was very common. It would usually have a black border around the edges, and the envelope it came in would also have a black border. So every time Lucretia Garfield would write a letter speaking of her husband, she would put it on this type of mourning paper after he died in perpetuity. So another common mourning accessory that I didn't talk about here was hair jewelry. So if you don't know what that is, it was jewelry made of human hair. It was braided and twisted in very complex designs, and it could serve as a necklace or a bracelet or a piece of a locket. Perhaps a piece of hair would be put behind a picture. And we have some Victorian hair jewelry in our collection, so I brought it down. If at the end of this presentation, when you're leaving, if you want to stop by and look at some of it, it's just kind of interesting. Okay, so we're moving on to President McKinley. McKinley died September 14th, 1901. He was also shot, shot in Buffalo, actually, while attending the Pan American Exhibition. So his death marks the first U.S. presidential assassination of the 20th century. And his funeral reflected the simplification of mourning rituals that accompanied this new era. So we see at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, mourning practices are really quickly going out of style. They're really loosening very quickly as people sort of modernize. So for the first time after the death of a sitting president, the White House facade is not decorated with black cloth for William McKinley. You can see here in the background, the north portico columns are not wrapped in black. This is due to a provision in an 1893 Appropriations Act. It prohibited draping on federal buildings. And people were not happy about this. One reporter complained, quote, "The existence of a federal statute prohibiting the draping of government buildings brought here and there into the outward show of the people's grief a hiatus, which detracted not a little from the otherwise impressive grandeur of the pageant. people were not happy that some people were, complaining that these rules were going away because they had been established and so set in stone for so long. It also seems that First Lady Ida McKinley observed older, stricter mourning etiquette after the death of President McKinley. She was an older woman when he died, and she remained in mourning clothing until at least 1904, so for at least 3 years. And she often wore a veil covering her face. I found an account from a memorial dinner for President McKinley that was held in 1904 that she attended, and there's a moment where she enters, everybody's looking at her, and she pulls back her veil, and like the audience applauds her because the reporter said, "To me, as to many, this was the great event of the whole evening." That the First Lady showed her face from under her veil. So this is a picture of the funeral procession leaving the White House for William McKinley. I'm pretty proud of finding this picture. This is the first time this picture has been shown in public. I collaborated with the McKinley Presidential Library, talked to their curator, told them what I was looking for, and they found this picture in their collection. It's never been published before my exhibit, so it's
Thank you.
a fresh new piece of history for us. Then we have the interior of the White House during William McKinley's funeral, for the East Room funeral. You can see that the interior also lacked decoration, very different from Abraham Lincoln's East Room funeral. The chandeliers and windows show no black drapery. There were no floral arrangements in the room, save the flowers that are on the casket. So right away, we're seeing a completely different type of funeral. And again, this is from Harper's Weekly. People were not happy about it. Harper's Weekly published several pages of buildings in various American cities that were ornamented heavily in black cloth. And this was probably to complain about Washington, D.C. not doing the same thing. The reporter wrote pretty pointedly, quote, "There was and there could be no federal statute forbidding the display of the panoply of sorrow upon the human temples of the soul, the great mass of the citizens themselves, shown in the shaken forms, in the bent heads, in the streaming eyes of the multitude, who turned out to pay the last tribute of respect to the man who had labored for so many years among and for them." So people thought it was disrespectful not to have the White House draped in black cloth. So unfortunately, no mourning gowns of Ida McKinley's exist or extant. There are several of her gowns that weren't mourning that exist, so I did want to show one to you because it demonstrates her fashion taste. So she really loved light colors, pastels, and she really loved ornamentation. She loved embroidery, sequins, beads. She would have little mirrors sewn onto her clothes. She really liked sparkle. She really liked flash. And we even know some of her dressmakers. She had some dressmakers in New York. She had a dressmaker in Baltimore. And while we don't know who made any of the mourning clothes that she would have worn for her husband, it's likely that she sort of used these established relationships she had with dressmakers who then could make her a suit of mourning clothes. But I feel bad for Ida McKinley because, she loved the sparkle, and then when she went into mourning, she had to sort of not wear any of that. This is from a magazine called The Delineator that is showing mourning fashions at the turn of the century. This is from 1901. Mourning fashion began to align more closely with fashion of the day. So you were allowed to have a little bit more embellishment. And the article actually that accompanied these images talks about some of these changes that are happening with mourning fashion. It says, quote, 3 months of absolute seclusion is now demanded before the widow may attend social functions of any character, the time formerly being 1 year. So this is a part of mourning that we haven't talked about, which is women were supposed to seclude themselves, to turn down any social invitation for a year in earlier periods that we saw, Lincoln's wife, some earlier presidents. But now it's only 3 months. You only have to stay inside for 3 months, and then you can begin your social life again after your husband dies. It's also noted that the heavy veils that women were supposed to wear, those were going out of style in favor of lighter, more transparent fabrics, and they rarely obscured the face anymore. So when crepe veils were worn, they often were worn sort of flowing down the back of the hat, not covering the face. So they would sort of wear these cascading veils down the back. So very pretty, but as Harper's Bazaar said in 1905, quote, "The crepe veil is worn, but more often on a hat than on a bonnet, and with its fullness adjusted in most graceful folds, until the original idea of a veil to hide one's features from the gaze of too curious or sympathetic friends has apparently been quite lost sight of." So, again, people are complaining. The women are showing their face while they're mourning. This is crazy. Again, Ida McKinley was a bit of an older woman. She didn't follow these less demanding rules. She continued to wear veils that obscured her face, and she refused social invitations for over a year after the assassination of President McKinley. I found a satirical print. It's from Life magazine. It's one of a series depicting various moments during a widow's mourning. She walks in the cemetery. She's wearing an elegant black gown. She's wearing the veil down the back of the head. And at the base of it, you can see there's a strip of mourning crepe, which was pretty common. I chose this image because there are accounts of First Lady Ida McKinley visiting her husband's resting place daily after he died. One friend wrote, quote, "In all the tragedies of the stage, there is no scene more sorrowful or dramatic situation more striking and painful than Mrs. McKinley at the coffin of her husband. No persuasion can cause the mourner to cease from weeping, bitterly, lamentably, without restraint." So, Ida McKinley's husband's death was very traumatizing for her, not only because, he was assassinated, but she was a very sickly woman, and she really depended on her husband to sort of get through life. And when he was assassinated, very quickly his advisors took over all of the funeral preparations from her, to the point where she was excluded from one of his funerals because they thought she might make a scene, and they nailed his coffin shut before she got to say goodbye to him. So it was a real tough time to be a widow. And then we're moving on to John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy died November 22, 1963. He was riding in an open car in Dallas, Texas when he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. Following the traditions of earlier 20th century presidential funerals, the mourning decorations were pretty subtle, but the funeral processions were modeled on Abraham Lincoln's funeral, which was meant to reflect the great grief of the nation. This is due to First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy's efforts. She really understood the power of visual communication, and she arranged for President Kennedy's funeral to be based on Abraham Lincoln's because she wanted to tie her husband's legacy to that of one of the greatest American presidents, right? She wanted to make those comparisons, those visual comparisons. So she reinstated the highly ceremonial state funeral, including the practice of using black fabric to decorate the people's house and to symbolically convey the extent of the nation's bereavement. So this is a photograph from 1963. It shows the North Portico entrance. The columns are not wrapped in black crepe as they were for presidents of the 19th century, but we do see this sort of drapery over the door frame. This cloth, I actually found that it was probably what's called a black cambric, which is a lightweight, closely woven cotton or linen fabric. And they used it because the upholsterer of the White House, his name was Larry Arata, he just had it in stock. He had this black cambric, so they quick pulled it out and used it to decorate the White House. Again, the draping of the White House and parlors in mourning cloth was reinstated. If you can see here on the chandeliers, there's black cloth here on the windows, and I believe on the mirrors there was as well. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy requested staff use the Harper's Weekly engraving that we saw earlier for Lincoln's Eastern funeral, she said, look at that and then copy it for my husband. So she really understood that this would be very powerful as an image. Let's see if this plays. Guess it doesn't want to. Oh no, there it is.
Oh my
Oops. Didn't work. Hold on a second. Uh-oh. I'm messing up. I want him to play a YouTube video. Do you know how to do that? If we can't, we can't, but. No? Okay, that's fine. I'll just show you the image then. Let's see, okay. So, we can't really see it, but there is a video of First Lady Mrs. Kennedy. She's at the Capitol, and she is standing on the steps of, she's standing on the steps of St. Matthew's Cathedral here with her 2 young children by her side as John F. Kennedy salutes his father's casket. She wore, we can look at this one, it might be easier. She wore a mourning veil she wears a long veil over her face. The choice of a veil was really unusual. By 1963, mourning veils had completely fallen out of fashion. Women were not wearing them. So the fact that she did, and that she reinstated the mourning drapery, suggests that she was again calling on the power of tradition. She wore a veil because it tied her to the 7 veiled widows of the 19th and early 20th century that came before her. We can see in this image, she's descending the stairs of the U.S. Capitol, and her face is framed by her mourning veil. She had lifted it to kiss her husband's casket. Her dressmaker, Oleg Cassini, remembered a conversation he had once with the First Lady. Quote, "We spoke of how fashion is a mirror of history. We discussed the message her clothing would send, simple, youthful, elegant, and how she would reinforce the image of her husband's administration through her presence." So she knew that this image of the immaculately dressed young widow, experiencing dignified grief would touch millions of people around the world who were watching on television. We talked a little bit about before how Americans were eager to participate in these mourning rituals. Now, in the 20th century, we have television, we have, millions upon millions of people participating. So it's interesting that Mrs. Kennedy's funeral outfit was actually a dress that she had owned and worn before. So she wore it to 2 other funerals. She wore it to Anthony Biddle, who was an ambassador in the U.S., and she also wore it to Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral in 1962. It was a 2-piece black wool suit. It was featuring a round, open cowl neckline and natural shoulders. It was accented by 2 large French buttons, and the suit was seamed and shaped to the body and had a straight skirt. So here she is in the same suit at the birth of her son, at the christening of her son. Her dressmaker was really interesting. He always implied that he was the one that had made this outfit, but she wore this 1960. This was a week before she started working with Oleg Cassini, her American designer who created all of her White House ensembles that are very famous today. So she wore it before she knew him, so he definitely did not create it. It is likely that this dress is by the fashion house Givenchy. Jacqueline Kennedy was a very big fan of very high-end French fashion. As First Lady, she was not allowed to wear it, but there are reports that she sneakily got herself to Paris, got herself fitted for some beautiful French clothing, and then smuggled them into the country. Her staff always vehemently denied this, but that's probably what happened. She really wanted to wear the nicest French stuff, including this suit, which is probably Givenchy. And there we have it. That was a few of the presidents who died in office, the rituals surrounding their death, including what their wives wore and what the White House wore. So, yeah, I'm opening it up to questions if you guys have any.
Was there anything on Eleanor Roosevelt's wedding or funeral attire?
Yes, so if you go to the White House Historical Association page and search this exhibit, Black Cloth, I do talk about FDR. That one is interesting because not only were FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt already sort of simple people, they didn't like a lot of ostentation. It was during the war, so FDR knew if I die, this is going to look very inappropriate. If we have this massive state funeral for me when people are really struggling, we have this intense war going on. So he wrote out the rules that he wanted for his funeral, and he said, I don't want to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. He was like, just send me home. I don't want to, I don't want to make a big deal about it. So he really wanted it to be less strict. And Eleanor Roosevelt, you see that, she does wear a veil, but her face is visible. She's working immediately. She doesn't, stay inside for a year. She was an activist. She was, a public figure. So by that time, it was acceptable for women, for widows to be going out. So, yeah.
So a lot of this was for upper class women. What were the so-called middle class or lower class? What would they do? Did they try to emulate it for a part, or?
Yes, exactly. So this was very much aspirational, right? This was proving I have so much money, I can buy a whole new outfit, I cannot go out for a year, I can, follow these very strict rules very closely, precisely, and that's because I'm an elite person, right? And so the middle classes, you see these rituals that started off sort of for monarchies, right? For kings and queens in Europe, they trickle down through the lower classes over time as people try to emulate these styles. Yeah.
The hat that came down into is that why they call a widow's peak when
Yes.
somebody can't serve here? It comes down a little bit.
Exactly.
Did it come from that, or?
I believe it did, yeah. So that's what that is from that cap. That widows would always sort of have this little peaked cap that they wore, and that was probably for about a century. Well, yeah, I would say about a century they did that, yeah. So, yeah. Yes.
Does the White House Historical Society have a YouTube channel?
They do. I do believe they have one, and they one of the videos that I was trying to show you of Jacqueline Kennedy, with her son saluting the casket, that's on their YouTube channel if you ever want to see it.
I was just gonna say, I was 13 when that happened, and I just still feel elegance, poise. From her, I'm still blown off by it, which is.
Right. And that was very deliberate. She knew that was sort of what people would take away.
And that was, I can't remember what I'm saying. I'd be asked. No, they looked to her how we should be.
Mm-hmm.
And she brought education back into the White House.
Mm-hmm.
She brought the elegance of the real world.
Yeah. She was very sort of international. She spoke a lot of languages. She spoke French fluently, a couple others. She was very educated, very poised, and she understood the importance of history and sort of creating the White House into a symbol of what we all want to be, right? An aspirational symbol. So she really worked hard at that, up to and including creating the White House Historical Association to sort of tell these stories.
Yeah. And she did not stop after her son, 100. When the husband died off,
Mm-hmm.
she did not step off.
Yeah.
She got even stronger
Yeah.
for all causes.
Right, and this is a time now that widows are allowed to be more participatory in the funeral processes. Like we talked about, Ida McKinley was not allowed. Other widows were not allowed to sort of engineer the funeral processions the way that Jacqueline Kennedy was. But I think she did insist. She said, no, I know what needs to happen, and really made it the sort of solemn spectacle that it was. Yeah.
applause. Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Quick PSA for everything coming up in March. Wednesday, March 4th is our next night at the museum, where Rachel will be doing some demonstrations with various artifacts that she's been working on. And then Saturday, March 7th at 2 p.m., it'll be our first ever, well, Rachel's first ever curator workshop. And she'll be talking about make, do, and mend, on how to preserve your antique clothing based off of what was done in World War I and World War II, actually. This was a big campaign that was done to preserve clothing. Next trivia is March 12th, Women of the Revolutionary War. And then March 13th, so Friday the 13th, I know, but No Blarney is coming back for our inaugural, or every year St. Patrick's Day concert, 2-hour concert, so we're very happy to have them back. Then we've got 2 guest speakers back to back. Wednesday, March 18th, Holly Watson, who is the Livingston County historian, will be talking about the Sullivan campaign, which is very prevalent in Livingston County history. And then the following night, on the 19th, Chris Mikowski, who's been here several times to talk about the Civil War, is actually going to talk about a new book he just wrote on John Adams. And then we end with Java with Joe, so the next one will be the March 26th. Michael Eula, our county historian, will be talking about his new book, Hidden Histories of Genesee County. I have some flyers up at the front. If you want one, you can feel free to take one. Everything is up on the website and Facebook and pretty much everywhere else we post. You'll see it on the email blast. So thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you the next time.
Thanks.